So the first thing I think that is important for you to share with your students is this idea of reflection and this idea of positionality and asking yourself as a field instructor, as a social worker, but also asking your students to reflect on their own preparedness. How are they able to look at this topic? And I often will draw like an imaginary line on this on the ground, and I tell students, I know that this is a difficult conversation for many people. I know that it's a taboo topic for some people. And I just ask respectfully for them to come up to the line, wherever that line is for them, but just to be kind of aware what that line means to them. What is it? What does it represent? And I use this idea of knowledge, skills, and attitude, or KSA, knowledge, skills, and attitude. And sometimes it's easy to think about attitudes as comfort or competence. And I asked them to start thinking about where are they at on this conversation, because they do this assessment, this self-assessment around all kinds of topics. As Sue indicated, I am fairly new to Australia. I moved there 6.5 years, and I knew immediately, because I had no experience working with the Aboriginal community, that I needed to look at my knowledge, skills, and comfort. And I needed to kind of rate myself in those areas. And so asking students to think about their knowledge, their skills, or their comfort, because they might be very comfortable working with, say, the queer community, but not have a lot of skills or knowledge in that area. So that's a good place to start as a self-assessment. And then reminding students that we as social workers engage in reflection throughout our career and helping them reflect on where did they get messages? Where does their positionality with this idea of sexuality? Were there messages from their faith group? Were there messages from their family, from their culture? Asking them what that means to them. And so prompting them to really get a good understanding of their positionality with this conversation. One of the things that they can do is start thinking about where do they need to increase their competency through readings, through trainings or workshops. How might they increase their understanding and their sexual literacy around this topic is a good place to start. So let's talk a little bit about the various areas of sexuality within social work. I've been doing this for a long time, and one of the things I tell my students, if I had to do it all over again, there's two things I would get a lot training in. One is addictions and recovery. The other is sexual health or sexual well-being, because inevitably those two issues always seem to walk into my office, or I encounter them when I'm working with people served. If not directly, it's a spouse or a sibling or a child. And so having a real thorough understanding of those topics is useful. I think it's also important for me as a social worker to know that I want to invite the entire person into the relationship. So when a person walks into my office or I'm engaging them in services, I want them to feel comfortable bringing all of them in self, all of their self into this. And this includes their spiritual and their faith life, their culture, their values, but also who they are as a sexual person. And that's just a piece of how I operate as a social worker. I want them to feel comfortable. I want them to bring their authentic self in. And I have to demonstrate that I'm capable of being in a space, witnessing and welcoming that aspect. It's my responsibility as a social worker to convey that knowledge, that skill, and that comfort to my clients, the people that I'm serving and working with. But there's often roadblocks that we bring to this conversation. And some of those roadblocks are our own baggage, that again, how do we view this topic? And let's face it, many of us have lots of baggage around sexual health, sexual well-being. We have been inundated with all kinds of messages around sex negativity, around sex is bad, that sex is only for reproduction, or only certain people are allowed to be sexual. And so recognizing what are those messages or baggage that we are bringing to this relationship is a good first step. Also, recognizing that traditionally we have a very limited scope of how we look at this topic. Many people, this includes our students and it includes the people that we're serving, tend to only focus on a behavior. They tend to focus on penile vaginal intercourse. They tend to focus on heterosexuality. And so recognizing that this conversation is really quite dynamic. It's very rich and it's much, much more than a behavior. That's the first conversation that I have with students. That when I talk about sexual health, sexual well being, I'm discussing a very nuanced, comprehensive, holistic model that I'm going to get to, that it is more pervasive than just a behavior. Oftentimes I use the baseball metaphor, and sometimes students recognize that they remember or they recall this idea of first base, second base, third base, and that is a model. Unfortunately, it's not a very strengths-based model. It's not a very healthy model because it conveys competition, and this model tends to favor heterosexual men, and it tends to favor penetrative intercourse. And so I'll have a discussion with students, a very frank discussion, if they understand this model, if they reference this model, if they're operating from this model, because sometimes that's how the people that we're serving and supporting, they also are coming into this conversation from this model. And then I will offer up other diverse kind of models, sometimes looking at what Al Vernacchio calls the pizza model. Al Vernacchio, you can YouTube him and look at, talks about a pizza model. That the nice thing about pizza is when you go out with your friends or people that you care about, you have this negotiation of what kind of things you want to put on the pizza. And that the pizza model is collegial, and it's a discussion and it's a negotiation. And that model of sexuality, looking at this pleasurable oriented space, is probably a healthier model than the baseball metaphor. The other thing I often ask students is to recognize that sexuality is privileged. And I ask them, who do we allow to be sexual? And I just ask them to brainstorm. Who is it that we think about that gets to access these conversations? And, some of the things that they come up with obviously are heterosexual or straight people. Pretty people get to be sexual. Men, able-bodied, married, white people. These are populations that have access to engaging in these conversations more so than other marginalized communities. Again, I want students to recognize and start to make the connections to some of our social work values and how sexuality fits within that. I also want them to see sexuality from a pleasure focus. That sexuality, a person served sexuality, is an asset. Their sexuality and relationships are part of a strengths based model. That if you are able to access that person's understanding of their sexual health, it gives you more understanding of who they are. It gives you an understanding of what they're bringing into the therapeutic or social work relationship. And it gives you another lens to see that person. So if you're able to use a strengths-based sexual health lens, that provides you as a social worker more understanding of who this person is. If I'm not able to bring my full self into the relationship and I feel like I have to guard part of who I am, you're never going to fully understand who I am and perhaps not fully understand what you're trying to help me with. And it could be anything from employment to housing. Again, if you don't know, for example, that I'm in a relationship, a long-term relationship with a male partner who is African American, that's an important piece in what you're doing as a social worker in helping me find housing or perhaps employment. Also, I want students to recognize the intersectionality of sexuality, that oftentimes aging disability, homophobia. Those things are a part of a sexual health assessment and in getting to know clients and recognizing how we, as a society, will put a lot of ageist or ableism onto clients and totally miss and silence who they are as sexual people. We have a history of silencing and segregating and putting in the shadows certain marginalized communities, such as the disabled community or the elderly community. I also want students to think about, again, this idea of sexual wellness as beyond intercourse, and for them to start thinking about all the ways that perhaps sexuality manifests in their interactions with the people that they're serving. Everything from body image to gender roles, to love and consent and flirting and all those things that, again, are under this really large umbrella of sexual health or sexual well-being. I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri, so any presentation has to have a reference to Wizard of Oz. And I recognize that many practitioners have this kind of lions and tigers and sexuality. Oh my, they're kind of scared of the conversation. And I remind students that I want them to bring rain. I want them to bring a heart and I want them to bring confidence and courage to this conversation, very much like the Wizard of Oz did. And for them to be prepared and be askable, to understand that if you convey your askability, clients are going to bring that part of who they are into the conversation. Students often don't recognize that the people that we serve are assessing us as social workers as much as we are assessing them. They're looking to see if we're safe. They're wanting to know, can they discuss the fact that they've terminated pregnancy? Can they discuss the fact that their partner and them like to have chemicals while they have a party and play environment on the weekends? If they think they're going to be judged, those aspects of that client's life are never going to come into the conversation. All too often, as social workers, if we do talk about this, we reduce the conversation to just LGBT issues, LGBTQ issues. While very, very important, there needs to be a broadening or an expansion to the conversation because it's important to know that there are aspects of sexual health and sexual well-being to the community beyond just LGBTQ. If we're only looking at that, then we have become very myopic in the way that we're viewing this topic, and we're missing the nuances of all the richness of this community. We often only look at disease, disaster, and dysfunction, the three Ds, if we're allowed to even discuss this at all. We look at STIs, HIV, pregnancy prevention, and maybe erectile dysfunctions. Those are the top three Ds. But again, I want students to think about sexuality as more than that. I also want students to recognize sometimes we bring microaggressions into these conversations. When we diminish someone, especially say in a skilled nursing facility, and we say, oh, isn't that cute? They are holding hands. That diminishes the quality of that relationship of that older couple that's in a skilled nursing facility. Or if we overly protect people with disabilities and say that's too risky, well, they can't do that. Again, that paternalistic nature of thinking of someone as immature or childish. Those are ways that we really diminish and take away from the dignity of people served when we bring those views or those, and they can be very, very subtle. And so I ask students to start thinking about how we how we slut shame certain people, how they dress, how we talk about behaviors as gross, or we talk about people being, act like your lady, act proper, or that's not a real relationship. And those are things that sneak into conversations. And I want students to be very reflective and aware when they do that, and to think about the microaggressions. So bottom line is, I want students to think about, how can we talk about sex? How can we bring sexuality and an understanding into our clinical work, into our social work? An exercise I ask students to imagine, could you put a name tag on your chest and say, I am an askable sexual health professional? And many of them say, yes, I can do that. Great. In this classroom, you can do that. Could you wear that throughout campus? Could you wear that home on the train? Could you wear that into the grocery store? Could you wear that at your place of worship? Could you wear that at dinner with your parents? Sometimes they will say, no, no, I couldn't do it in this location. And then we'll have a discussion. Why? What is it about saying that I'm an askable sexual health professional that brings you anxiety? And have a whole discussion around what that means. Because the reality is, as social workers, we engage in really taboo conversations all the time, really difficult conversations all the time. I share with students, I don't like talking about suicidality, but I am mandated. I have to be able and capable of having conversations with people about that topic, around poverty, around housing issues, around homelessness, around addictions. I also want students to recognize that people we serve, they are immersed just like we are. They are immersed in a environment of sexuality and sexual health and so it's all around us, and for them to see that that's a part of who they are. I'm going to pause just for half a second and just to make sure that people can hear me. I know that people might have questions, but I think you were prompted to maybe um, send questions via chat to Sue. But can everybody still hear me? Is that okay? Sue, can you give me a thumbs up if you're able to still hear me? Yes? Okay. Okay. I'll keep going. So what are we talking about? I often will refer academics to the WHO definition, the World Health Organization definition of sexuality, and maybe bringing that into conversations with students so that they have an understanding of the comprehensiveness and the richness of sexuality. And that can give some people an understanding that sexual well-being is an issue. It's a quality of life issue. And this is why we discuss this. This is why we bring this into our interactions with the people that we serve. That sexuality is a cradle to grave issue. It happens throughout our lifespan. So this is not just an issue where we talk to 10-year-olds or 13-year-olds about reproduction. No, we're talking to the gamut, and it's age appropriate, it's holistic, it's comprehensive, and we target how we interact and how we talk about this based on the range of ages that we're working with. That for social workers, this is a sexual justice issue. This is a social justice issue, from marriage equality to reproductive choice to rape culture to access to sex information. If you are a person with disability and you don't feel like you can go to your support worker and ask how to buy adult toys, or you can access transportation to a sex store that has accessibility so that you can access this. This is a social justice issue. The other issue is that many of the people that we serve walk in with shame or guilt, and I want to bring a sex positivity to this conversation with the people that we serve. And I want students to recognize, what does sex positivity mean, and how do they avoid the prevalence of sex negativity that we're inundated with in society, but also that sometimes we unknowingly will bring to conversations. And I want them to have an ability to have affirming affirmation around a person's sexuality, and to be curious how the person served views their sexual life and what aspects that they want to bring into this therapeutic relationship. What parts do they want to share with us? What parts do they want us to understand? It's also a part of our ethics and referring them back to the ethical standards that they as a social worker have regarding providing quality support around respect and dignity, promoting social justice, and valuing human relationships. I will also refer them to the idea of the strengths perspective, which is rooted within social work, assets, and making the connection around a person's sexual health and sexual being for them to understand that is a strength, and that if they're providing social work support, to see that aspect of this person. Also, recognizing that we as social workers operate from a biopsychosocial approach. I would add spiritual and sexual approach, a lens, that if they can add to that biopsychosocial lens, the spiritual, and they would, most students will say, yes, that's very important. I should understand a client's faith and belief systems. And so then the leap to understanding who they are as a sexual person fits very nicely within that model that all social work students should be familiar with. Very quickly, if you're looking for a tool or tools to help the discussion and help the learning for students, I refer you to the circles of sexuality and the Plisted model. And I'm just going to briefly talk about these very valuable models. The Circles of Sexuality by Dennis Daly, who was originally from the University of Kansas. What I like about this model is it forces us, it helps us look at sexuality beyond reproduction. That is an aspect of this, but it shows other very critical areas of this discussion. Most importantly, what I love about this is this sixth circle recognizes values, the belief system, the systems that the client brings to this conversation, how they look at this conversation through their own personal beliefs and values. That to me is really what makes this model very useful, and helping them understand that we as social workers, if we conceptualize sexuality beyond reproduction, very much an important discussion, but recognizing that things like intimacy, authenticity. Dennis Daly talked about intimacy, emotional intimacy, as the willingness to be known, a willingness to take risk and to engage with people in an authentic manner. That is critical to our understanding of a person. The other model is the Plisted model. And what I would focus students on here is that all too often social workers will say, I can't talk about sexuality. Let's send that to an expert. Only experts can talk about that. And I'm like, no. I'm not an expert in addictions, but I do have a pretty good working foundational knowledge of what addictions is, what recovery looks like. I know my local AA and NA groups in my community. I know how to make referrals. I can engage in a conversation. I can provide permission to people that I'm working with to start that conversation. All social workers can engage in permission giving regarding sexual health. And so I use this model for students to say, we can engage in limited information, discussing, for example, that birth control can have an impact on sexual arousal. It can have an impact on antidepressants can have an impact on a person's desire level. Those are basic limited informations that we can engage in with people served. So the other aspect, the last objective, becoming familiar with a sexual well-being practice lens. This boils down to being askable, knowing the resources in your community, having referrals on speed dial, where you can make referrals to a person if to a professional in the community, providing reassurance to this person about their sexual health and sexual well-being, that they're in the right spot with you as part of their healthcare team to help them navigate, recognizing your own values, your own positionality, and looking at this from a sexual justice point of view. I'm going to skip this piece here. Just tells you a little bit more about a sexual wellness informed practice lens. So I kind of run through a lot of different pieces here, but I want to allow time for some questions. And I was told to end so that we can have some discussion. This is kind of just an overview of some of the things that we've covered today, but I really would love to entertain some of your questions, and I want you to kind of think about those. I also want to give you some information and some resources so that you can kind of continue to have this discussion beyond today. Most importantly, these are some things that are available. These are available on my website, so you can go to my website and you can download them if you're interested in book chapters. That is drgeorgeturner.com, drgeorgeturner.com. These are some book chapters that I've written. Here are some peer-reviewed articles if you're looking to augment some learning conversations with your students. The latest was around sexual justice, and I talk about the landscape of the news, most notably in the U.S. And the political cycle that's happening right now, but all the undertones of things like don't say gay and trans violence and reproductive justice. Those are things I captured in this most recent article. But also on my website, there's several podcasts and some videos that you might find useful in just sparking a conversation with your students. Finally, here's some ways that you can get in touch with me if you want to continue this discussion. By all means, I love to hear from people, but you can reach me at my email address. It's g.turner@westernsydney.edu.au. And I'm going to be on sabbatical for the next few months, so it might be a little bit delay in me responding to your emails, but I will absolutely do my best to get back to you in a timely way. And I love having communications after the presentation. So I think that's everything that I was supposed to cover. I realized that was a whirlwind. But Sue, I hope I made our time commitment. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to continue just a collegial discussion with people.
Absolutely. I have a question on my chat box. Somebody asked, we work in a colonial and litigious work environment where a conversation with students about sexuality might break the law. How do we have a conversation with students without breaking the law or making students uncomfortable?
So if I think I heard it, how do we have conversations with students without breaking the law
Yeah,
or making them uncomfortable?
uncomfortable. Yes, or making them
Okay.
uncomfortable.
I don't know that I can speak to the law piece because I don't know Canadian law. And I'm not sure exactly what the person might be referencing. But from an educational standpoint, sexual health and sexual well-being, I believe, is a part of our academic responsibility to talk about those things. And as far as making students uncomfortable, I also see that as part of my responsibility, not necessarily intentionally, like I go out of my way to make students uncomfortable, but the very nature of social work, it's an uncomfortable profession. And as I said, I often tell students, I totally respect that we all come to this conversation from different values and different backgrounds, and it is just an uncomfortable piece. But as a social worker, I have to be willing to talk to students or to people served about their drug use, about their grief, talking about the death of family members. That's is really uncomfortable, but it's a part of my job as a social worker to help people through that journey. And that often brings up my own grief. I tell students I often will tear up with clients, and I will tear up even when I'm presenting. I was just in New York and I was presenting to a student to a human sexuality class, and I mentioned my mother who's been who's passed for 15 years, and I started tearing up in class. So I think, I had this conversation with students about us being authentic educators, us being authentic social workers, that what we do is more times than not, it's just uncomfortable. But that's what we do is we help students, we help clients, we help people navigate those difficult places. And quite honestly, I think students have to be uncomfortable. They have to be exposed to uncomfortableness within a academic, scholarly, safe environment because out there in the world, what my clients throw things at you all the time, just out of the left field. They just start talking about things, and sometimes I was having a lovely conversation this morning with Anne about, I've had clients pull a knife on me. You know, I've had clients call me every possible word in the dictionary, and they were really mean and crude to me. But I knew that I had to work through that with the client in order to actually support that person, that was all stuff that they were just throwing at me because they were uncomfortable, because they didn't want to do the work. So helping students get comfortable with the uncomfortable, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. That's what social work is. In the last political cycle, I was in the US, and it was very common for me to have conversations with people that I was supporting around the politics of their family and how to navigate politics. And they were very uncomfortable with the idea of what was going on in the world. And they were scared, or they were concerned about going home for the holidays and what kind of conversations were going to happen with their family. And so that was part of my job, to help them really understand how to make sense of that and find meaning in that potential uncomfortable conversation that they were going to have with their family. I hope I answered that question. And if not, the person is welcome to chime into the conversation. So, next question.
I don't have any question on the chat box, but if anybody else has any question for George, you can ask him directly, or you can also write into the chat box.
I see a whole laptop screen of blank screens. It's a speaker's worst nightmare, just looking at black screens. Thank you, Ann. Thank you. Hi, good to see people. Hi, Amanda. Hi, Laura. Hi, Leslie. What kind of questions, or what have I not, or do you want to challenge anything that I've shared? Hi, Fraser. I know I threw a lot at you. How might you use this I'm assuming you're all field instructors or academics. How might you use this with your students, or what hesitation do you have about the topic?
I see Dorina has her hand up.
Hey, Janice. Hi, George. I have a question that's not exactly related to the question you just threw out to us. Can I go back
Sure.
to that? Thank you so much for your presentation. I really, really appreciate it. I work in the field of sexual trauma. So I really appreciated some of the models that you shared, because in terms of helping people recover from sexual trauma, such a huge part is talking about healthy sexuality, obviously choice, and I love the whole part about kind of the broader concepts of sexuality, and that it's not just about penetration, and that sex can be a wonderful thing, and intimacy can be a wonderful thing, and all of those pieces. So yeah, really appreciated that model. I'm curious, what if you could maybe speak to what conversations you have with folks around some of the shifting attitudes and norms in terms of hookup culture versus committed relationships, and I find that lots of clients struggle with sort of the moral pieces of different sexual interactions and relationships,
Right.
casual encounters, especially in the wake of sexual trauma. And
Absolutely.
wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Davina, for bringing that up. And I think it is important when we're working around sexual trauma, because sometimes that's one of the accepted things for us to talk about. And that's one of the things that we're often called in as social workers to discuss. And in my work, inevitably, clients also want to bring the conversation back. How do I reintroduce pleasure, or how do I remake friends with, and how do I get to a space where that I can be back, where that this is not the only piece that's consuming my life. And I think it's really crucial for us as social workers to have that conversation with clients, especially clients that are in services around rape, incest, other forms of sexual trauma, to recognize what that looks like. I worked in recovering addictions, and it's a pretty common mandate that you don't have a relationship for a year while you're in recovery. And oftentimes clients would say, the only way that I could have sex was when I was plastered or I was totally messed up, and I don't know how to have sober sex. And so they just avoided anything and they might be in a relationship. So being able to wade into those conversations, almost like wading into a pool with clients, I think oftentimes they welcome that. They're not sure exactly how to navigate that. And sometimes certain services seem like they don't want to talk about that stuff. And so I think broaching that with clients, that we can start building a holistic, comprehensive, healthy understanding of what sexuality can mean for you, is welcomed by clients. And there was a second piece to your question, and remind me what that was with students.
It was around kind of those social concepts and constructs around like hookup
Yeah,
culture,
yeah.
committed
And so,
relationships, and the
yeah,
whole gamut.
yeah. So in Australia, predominantly my students come from a Muslim community, a fairly conservative community. And so I have conversations with my students to remind them that we're allowed to have our own views, our own values, our own views around all kinds of topics, including sex and sexuality. But is important for us to understand and respect where our clients are coming from. So for the example I would use with my students is Sydney, Australia has a vibrant gay community. And I said, if you don't know about the gay bars in Sydney, or you don't know that we have sex on premises places, if you don't know about those, then you're at a disadvantage, and you're not going to be able to work with a certain population with it that's predominant in Sydney. And if you're the only hospital social worker on duty at 3 a.m. and a gay man walks in, and you've never thought to become educated and knowledgeable and skilled about that community, you're not going to do very good social work. So while I can retain my values, and I talk about differentiation, and I talk about staying whole and complete, and being in company with Davina and who Davina is, and recognize who she is. And I'm not going to lose myself because Davina believes in multiple gods. I'm not going to lose myself because that is your faith. And I can appreciate your belief system. And that's a part of me developing myself professionally as a social worker. And so I often will talk about conversations around faith to help people understand how they might do that around sexuality. That, for example, clients might ask you, when you're doing hospice social work, they might ask you to pray because grandmother has just passed away and they want to say a prayer for grandmother. How do you deal with that with if you're Muslim and your clients are Christian? How are you going to approach this invitation to pray with this family that you've been working with for the last 3 months? And I asked them to think about that. What is that? Do you tell the people I'm not praying with you? Or do you just close your eyes and reflect and honor who they are and honor their faith in that prayer, and they've invited you into that. So I think helping students start to reflect on that and make sense of that is really where you can do the most important work. I'm not there to give my students the answer. I'm there to help them make sense of their life. How are they going to manage those clinical relationships, those therapeutic relationships with the people that they serve? Because if you're in a metropolitan area like Toronto, you're working with people from all kinds of belief systems, but all kinds of understandings of sexuality. And it's all right for you to have your thoughts around hookup culture, but hookup culture is really prevalent. It's really a part of a lot of people's lives. And while you may not value that or understand that, it may not be for you to understand that it's a part of your client's life, and be able to engage in conversations with what that means to them. That's good social work, to show that you're askable and knowledgeable. I will oftentimes say, when I moved to Sydney, I had a client ask me about MDMA. I had no idea what MDMA is. It's the chemical formula for a drug called ecstasy. I knew what ecstasy was, but I had to have this kind of really frank conversation with the client. I had to look vulnerable. I had to look a little bit out of the know. Oh, now I know. Now we can have this conversation. That's a part of what we do as social workers all the time. You might not understand the nuances of hookup culture or even really value those things. But if it's a part of your client's life, if it's part of the life of people that you're serving, it's important for you to get knowledgeable and comfortable having those conversations. I hope that answered your question, Davina.
Yes, thank you.
Other questions? Only one brave soul. This is where I would typically threaten my students to call upon them. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I am kind of curious if anybody would have any struggles that maybe I could help you with, or even your own trepidations. I mean, I tell people, not all people that come to this conversation as instructors, as social workers, as seasoned social workers, have been given a foundational understanding of being able they come to this conversation with some concerns, and that's okay. That's absolutely okay. Anyone else? If not, we can end.
Thank you, George. Thank you for your amazing presentation. It was very thought-provoking for sure, because as social workers, when we are doing our assessment, there are so many areas of life that we sort of assess clients on, and sexual health is something that comes towards the end, or that doesn't even sort of that doesn't even get included into our assessment many times, right? So there is that comfortability, there is the values. There's so many things that kind of come into play. So I'm very grateful for this presentation, and something to think about and include into our assessment going forward as social workers. And thank you all for participating and being here. And thank you, Dorina and others who asked questions. And I hope to see you again next month, sorry. In October, we have another speaker coming, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion then. Until then, stay safe and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.